Welcome to Off Hours, a conversation between Jon Edwards and Chris Manning.
A little bit of follow-up from last week's episode on Simon Winchester's book, The Perfectionists. We certainly got a lot of great feedback from various people after our discussion of the book, including from Mr. Winchester himself. He retweeted our episode and he listened to it and seemed to enjoy it. So that was nice to get a little bit of feedback from the author himself, and from everyone else as well. We had a lot of great feedback on that, and a few people who've either read the book or who are now interested in reading the book because of it. So I hope you guys enjoy it. In that vein, if you do happen to enjoy that book, a few other books that I'd recommend reading are from Ross King. He's written a few books dealing with historical figures and historical times, and he tends to focus more on a specific person versus something like what Simon did with this with the Perfectionists, where he's dealing with sort of snippets of different things over a period of time. The two that I'd recommend from Ross King are Brunelleschi's Dome and the Pope's Ceiling. So the first one is dealing with the construction of the dome over the cathedral in Florence. At the time that it was being built, nobody knew how to build the dome. In fact, the architect who designed the original cathedral designed it knowing that he had no idea how to build the dome and that he didn't think it could be built. But he also knew that he was going to be dead before that problem arose. So he designed it anyways and left it for somebody else's problem. And eventually Brunelleschi comes along and he understood how to build the dome. So this book deals with the story of how he eventually was able to get the commission to do it, deals with some of the politics and infighting of being an artist in 15th century Florence, I guess 16th century Florence. Certainly a nasty place to be an artist, but also quite a prosperous time to be an artist as well. The Medici at the time were spending obscene amounts of money on art and science, and so if you were a talented artist at the time, you could rely on them to be a patron for you. So, anyways, it's a fabulous book. The dome itself is a remarkable piece of engineering. In fact, until the early 80s, when the Superdome was built in Texas, it remained the largest unsupported dome in the world. So it's a remarkable feat of engineering, even by modern standards. There are not a lot of domes out there that are the same, that are larger, that are unsupported. So that's a fascinating book. And then the other one, The Pope's Ceiling, deals with Michelangelo's painting of the Sistine Chapel. And because of the Sistine Chapel, we primarily know Michelangelo as a painter, but he considered himself to be a sculptor, and that's what he cared about. That's what his passion was, and that's what he wanted to do. And this story talks about how Pope Sixtus was able to convince Michelangelo to paint the walls of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and the trials and tribulations of that. And then also how he ended up coming back to paint the altar wall many, many years later. In fact, I think there was 40 or 50 years between when he painted the ceiling and when he painted the altar wall, and what was involved in trying to get him back to do that, because he was not a big fan of finishing that project.
And I think his self-portrait that he hid in that altar wall is quite a testament to how he felt about that.
That altar wall is brilliant. There's some great stories in there. I think one of my favorites is about a cardinal who he believed that the paintings that Michelangelo was doing were disgusting and immoral and obscene, and he would go in and he would berate Michelangelo constantly while he was working, and he would attack him, and he would He was basically a horrible person. He was the Renaissance version of a Twitter troll. Michelangelo finally got sick and tired of it, and so the painting is the descent into hell. So you've got people descending into hell and the various trials and everything like that that they're dealing with, and the horrible things that they have to put up with, and He painted just above there's a little door on the altar wall, and in fact nowadays that's where you come into the Sistine Chapel, is through this little door. And above that door there's a man who's naked, and there's a snake eating his genitals, and that man is this particular cardinal. And so he painted him into the wall, as a sinner descending into hell. Of course, the cardinal complained to the Pope about this. And the Pope just looked at him and he's like, look, you've been attacking this guy constantly. You've been, you've been a horrible person to this guy. He didn't blame him for painting him in there. All sorts of wonderful little stories about that, those paintings, all of them, and the trials and tribulations of dealing with the papacy as your patron. So anyways, both are excellent books. Highly recommend reading them. They've been out for a little while. I think the Pope's Sealing was published 2000, sometime around that. He's done other books about various other artists. He's done one about the Impressionists. He's done one about Machiavelli. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, a little bit of history, very, very well written. His style of writing is excellent. It's very easy to read. So I highly recommend those. If you enjoyed Simon Winchester's book, give Ross King's books a try. I think you might enjoy those as well.
And both works are definitely worth checking out in person as well. It's awe-inspiring to behold. And a little pro tip for the Sistine Chapel. Most of the time, because it is such a tourist attraction, it's standing room only, shoulder to shoulder, sweaty mess in there. But if you make it to the Vatican first thing in the morning, before it opens, and are able to get somewhere near the front of the line, and when you enter, if you traverse the galleries in reverse and book it, as my wife and I did when we went and visited, and we just blew by all of Raphael's frescoes and right past Rodin's The Thinker, and we were able to make it before anyone else really had made it at all. There was one very small, we'll call it an elite tour group, because they somehow got some preferential treatment and were able to...
They'd been allowed in early.
Yeah, exactly. They got in early. There was no one else in there, but so you could hear the echo of your voice in the room. I was able to lie flat out on the floor and take it on, which if you try that in the middle of the day, you are going to get trampled. Exactly.
You'll get crushed, yes.
Yeah, so it was just phenomenal to be able to take Michelangelo's work in without being jostled and bumped about. And it really is just breathtaking to be able to see just the detail that he put into each and every one of those frescoes, and knowing the amount of work that went into each and every one, and the years of his life that he sacrificed to this project truly is incredible.
Yeah, unfortunately, when I was there, I had to deal with the masses of people. I was in with a group, and so we ended up at the Sistine Chapel at the end of the tour, as you normally do. And so it was just a sea of humanity in there. It was ridiculous, the number of people that were in there. Being able to jump the mass of people is also worthwhile. We did that when we were at the Taj Mahal. The trick to that is that you get there before sunrise, because they open the park at sunrise, and everybody gets into the park, and they're the famous reflecting pools in front of the Taj Mahal, and everybody stops at the first reflecting pool and starts taking photos from there. And the trick is that you keep going on, and there's a break in that reflecting pool, and you stop halfway down. And so what happens is everybody, all the other keeners, are behind you taking photographs of the Taj Mahal with you in it, and you're taking photographs of the Taj Mahal with nobody in it. So I have some fabulous photos of the Taj Mahal, absolutely nobody in them, and I got to wander around a lot of the park for about a half hour without anybody in any of my photographs. So if any of these popular destinations, if you can get there very early and often do the thing that people are not doing, so go to the prime attraction first or whatever, you can often get away from the groups.
And there are a number of galleries around Rome as well that will have lesser known works and well-known works by the likes of Michelangelo and Da Vinci. And I have to say, I actually enjoyed taking in a number of Michelangelo's rough sketches as much as I did in taking in his finished complete pieces. And a lot of those sketches are things too that I hadn't seen in any books before. And I have quite a number of books from the Ninja Turtles on my shelves.
Yeah, and also if you end up in Florence, there's some great pieces of his if you go to the Art Academy there, which is where the original David is. So if you see David out in the square in front of or near the Uffizi in Florence, that's not the original. That's a copy that's been made. The original has been moved indoors to protect it from the elements. But inside of that gallery as well are the prisoners, and they are a series of sculptures that he was working on, these massive stone blocks that he was working on. And you can see the people are partially exposed from the stone, but he abandoned them, and so they look like people that are sort of trying to escape from these stones. And it's fabulous being able to see these pieces halfway through, or not even halfway through the process, sort of partially through the process. And so it's nice to be able to see that, that the process of sculpting and what it would have looked like partway through.
Yeah, which is very revealing and gives you some insight into the way that Michelangelo's mind worked too, because I haven't done any serious sculpture, messed around with some soapstone and things like that. But I generally rough things out, or I shouldn't say generally. The only times I've sculpted, I rough things out and then slowly dial in the detail. And on these pieces, there literally are just big chunks of rock still there, while other areas it looks like a nearly finished piece. You can see the progression of chisel marks and his working lines. I've heard a quote. He had said I'm just going to draw a blank on exactly how the quote goes. Do you know the quote I'm referring to?
Somebody asked him, how do you carve a figure from stone? And he says, you just remove all the parts that aren't the figure.
Exactly. And then those unfinished works are exactly a picture of that.
Yeah, you can see his process, and you can see his thinking behind how he's doing that. Yeah, there's a number of great galleries there. The Uffizi is another one in Florence if you get to. That's just fabulous. I could spend weeks just wandering through a handful of places in Rome and Florence and not be bored. There are some amazing works there.
Mm-hmm.
It's and as I mentioned, it's also telling when you hear about the Medici, because of the Medici were not great people in a lot of ways. They were tyrannical in many ways. If you were one of their enemies, you were probably not long for this world. They were pretty ruthless. But when you look at the amount of money that they spent on art and technology and science, they pretty much single-handedly as a family kickstarted the Italian Renaissance. They were spending many times the GDP of Florence on art and science every year, and which is remarkable when you think of a single family, a single institution like that being able to do it. They were pretty much single-handedly responsible for funding some of these artists and keeping them going. So some of the stories that come out of both of these books are fascinating, hearing about the Medici and hearing about, sort of 15th, 16th century Italian politics. So moving from books to movies, we've spoken a lot about documentaries in previous episodes and the fact that we do enjoy watching documentaries. I just wanted to touch a little bit on a few documentaries that I've seen recently. One that's come up recently, and a few that are related that I've seen over the years that I'd recommend. One of the things that I'm interested in, as well as the 100,000 other things that I do, is letterpress and printing using physical type on paper. And this is a process that's been around for 1,000 years. It's movable type press comes in with Gutenberg, but we know of a physical print matrix of some sort being used in printing for a long time. So this isn't anything new, but I love the idea of physically printing, and it's something that Tamara and I are looking to explore a little bit more, is using a letterpress to produce various things. And so there was a new documentary that came out this year called Pressing On, the letterpress film. And this is something that we were looking forward to quite a bit. It had been a few years in the making, and there had been a couple of notable people in the letterpress world who had been interviewed for the documentary. It was something that we were kind of looking forward to. It's very promising when it opens up. There's a great little anecdote of one of the people that's interviewed in the film, and as a young man, how he gets sort of trapped into learning more about letterpress and how how it fascinates him and how he gets involved with it. I have to say that overall the documentary was pretty weak. This is one of those documentaries where it's primarily interviews with people who are collectors and occasional practitioners of letterpress, but it does very little to sort of expand upon what's letterpress, how it's being done, the processes that are being involved. So by the end of it, I know a little bit about letterpress just because I've done a lot of research in it, and so I know things like what's happening when you're inking the letterpress and how you're laying out the type and things like that. But if you don't know that already, coming out of this film, you won't have any better understanding of how letterpress works. You'll basically have some sort of below average interviews with people who do letterpress or who collect the machines that are being used for letterpress. So I was a little bit disappointed with this film, which is too bad because it had a lot of potential, for sort of delivering some interesting information about letterpress. And it got me thinking about a couple of other printing related documentaries that I've seen over the last couple of years that are worth checking out. So if this is a topic that's of any interest to you, you don't necessarily need to avoid pressing on, but it's certainly not the type of thing that you should watch as a first letterpress documentary, because it's really not going to give you any understanding about the basics of it. Two printing films that I do recommend. The first is Linotype, the film, and this was directed by Doug Wilson. And this talks about the Linotype machine, which was being used in sort of production printing. If you look back at the New York Times or any large newspaper, for instance, they were being typeset on using a Linotype machine. And it was a machine that you could type on. It had a keyboard on it. And it was also a machine that had hot lead in it that would cast type. And so you would type a line and it would then go off and it would cast that line of type into lead. And then that lead block of text could then be used in a traditional printing press, and you would then be able to print your pages based on that. So Linotype, the film, is a really interesting documentary. And unlike the letterpress film, Pressing On, this one you'll actually understand the process. You can see the machines in operation. There are people there who explain what's going on and how these are actually used. So it's a great documentary, and it's a really good example of how a documentary on a technical subject should actually be directed and edited. So that's certainly worthwhile. So that's Linotype, the film. So the other one I recommend is Making Faces, Metal Type in the 21st Century by Richard Kegler. This is a documentary that follows a Canadian graphic artist by the name of Jim Rimmer, and it's following him making some original lead type that, so this is going to be hand-set metal type that can be used in printing. And it was the first time that anybody had actually created a new typeface and released the digital font and the handset metal font at the exact same time. So it was an interesting look at a man who'd spent his career producing typefaces professionally. And then sort of in his retirement, he ended up creating a number of unique typefaces and was able to release some of them digitally as well as make physical type that was being used by people in the letterpress industry. So it's a relatively short documentary, but it is good, and it doesn't show the entire printing process really. It's not a great film for that. I think Linotype is a better documentary for showing off the printing process, but this is a really good look at sort of how somebody would create this type originally, and it goes a little bit farther than something like Helvetica, where Helvetica is talking about the design and how that new typeface was being created, but it was really being created for a digital world. This is all about creating physical type that you would then be able to set in a printing press and use. Definitely worthwhile. Again, Making Faces and Linotype, I would definitely recommend those.
In a similar vein, something that crossed my radar recently that I found somewhat interesting was the digitization of an older typeface called Wallbaum, and the digitization was done by Charles Nix and some other typeface designers alongside him. But this was a very groundbreaking and popular typeface in its era when it was first made for printing presses. And there have been a number of attempts over the years to digitize it, but none quite did it justice and scaled in the same way. So when a designer like Jim Rimmer would craft the typeface in the metal, the designer is going to make different affordances depending on how big the various sizes are. So if it's making a very small, tightly set version of the typeface that they've created, the weight and kern of each letter is going to be different at a very small typeset than it's going to be at a much larger typeset. So let's say to put it in digital terms, a font size of say 120 versus a font size of 6. In most digital typefaces or fonts that we have today, you're basically going to have the same glyphs at both ends of the spectrum. So generally you have fonts that are better for reading on a screen or on paper and better for small type versus a very large set type. And what these designers have done with Wilbaum is gone in and put in that same level of care and perhaps even more care looking at the end result than the original designer of the typeface would have put in, creating all these individual metal blocks for each size that the type could be set in. And it's an impressive endeavor, and it took them a number of years, but for all intents and purposes, the end result seems well worth it. And we'll link to that in the show notes as well.
Yeah, I love the idea of typefaces. There's a part of me in the back of my brain that thinks if I ever have the free time to play around with it, I'd love to try making my own metal type. And I don't know if I'd ever design my own typeface, but it would be interesting to make metal type to be able to do printing. I don't know that I'm ever going to get around to that because there are other ways of producing print matrices that are far more convenient in a modern age than producing blocks of lead. But it's an interesting idea, and I've always found this fascinating, and something like making faces, it really gives you some insight into how somebody can create a new typeface and the things that make it different than another typeface that you're seeing. So I love seeing this kind of thing, and hopefully if other people are fascinated by graphic design and this kind of work, then they'll check this out and find it interesting.
Now, looking back on a slightly more esoteric period of history, what do you think about engine turning a watchmaker's cane?
Well, I guess the first question is what exactly would a watchmaker's cane entail? What would it have in there?
Well, I'm envisaging a lovely engine-turned Fabergé-esque top to it, where you could screw off the top, which would contain the loop. And then beneath that, a series of screwdrivers and tweezers in little holes. In much the same way that a flare gun walking stick would have a flare gun in it, or the way a magician's table cane would turn into a table for a magician to his tricks on.
So just in case you need to spontaneously repair a watch at a dinner party, you can do some work on that.
Precisely.
Yeah, there's some fabulous canes out there in history, and we've talked a little bit about Fabergé work in the past, and their most popular item was certainly the cigarette case. Anybody who was anybody had a Fabergé cigarette case or Cartier. There are a number of other little items that we don't really use today in modern society that were very popular amongst people shopping at Fabergé's boutiques, and one of them was canes and parasols. Those were the two that come to mind. That we just don't use anymore. And there's some really fabulous engine-turned, jeweled, some of them are carved in hard stone, cane handles, some of them are parasol handles, as I said. And there's some beautiful work out there from that kind of era. These days there's not a lot of call for sort of decorative canes, but most of them are practical canes for people who need them for medical reasons. Yeah, there's certainly some interesting ideas out there for odd canes from sort of 100 years ago.
And what brings this up is a Rao Antiques, who has a wide variety of decorative system and weapons canes available for purchase, anywhere from about $1,000 up to price available upon request, for all manner of different crafts or purposes. Everything from a woman of the night's cane to a Japanese sake cane to a sailor's cane, a doctor's cane, you name it. And someone probably at some point in history has made it.
Yeah, it's one of those odd little quirks of history that we don't keep around. We've just never kept around, and in some cases, particularly here in Canada, many of those canes would be illegal. Any kind of hidden weapon cane is certainly highly illegal here in Canada. So, yeah, you'd have a difficult time trying to import some of that for sure.
Any of these jump out at you as being a particular favorite, or one you wouldn't mind waltzing around town with?
I'm not sure that I'd waltz around town with many of them. They're a little bit ostentatious for what I would be doing.
No, I quite like the sailor's navigation cane, but that's probably because it's somewhat reminiscent of what a watchmaker's cane might contain, in that it has some magnifying gear, and then it has a compass, which is reminiscent of a pair of tweezers, and then several other little odds and ends all stuffed in there. I do have a very handy pocket knife that is designed for watchmakers, the Minotaur from Swiss Army Knives, or Victorinox, and that has actually come in handy quite a number of times, and something that size would stash easily the same amount of gear into the head of a cane. But the Fabergé ones on here really are lovely too.
Yeah, so these cane handles are fabulous pieces. I would love to try experimenting with some of these shapes and these ideas, but of course they're not really practical, and you can tell that these were designed for people who for whom practicality was not high on their list of requirements. So if you've ever walked around with a cane, having one with a hook on it is very handy, because then you can hook it on the side of a table, for instance, so that you don't have to fumble around and try and hold it or whatever. Whereas a cane like this, it's just a straight handled cane. You can't really put a lot of weight on it, so this is really for decorative purposes. And also trying to sort of put it down somewhere would be awkward. So I suspect you were probably handing this to a butler or a servant of some kind. But I love the design ideas. I love some of the shapes of these. They do look quite lovely.
Now, in contrast to these, you mentioned practicality. Let's say a designer whose work exudes practicality and who's looked up to by pretty much any industrial designer of our modern day is Dieter Rams. We've mentioned his forthcoming documentary by Gary Hustwit that will be coming out this autumn. But I saw an interview recently with Rams, and the cane that he had was essentially a perfect circle at the top. And it's not a cane. I hadn't seen anything quite like it before. And there was a Q&A session at the end of the talk or panel discussion rather. And I really had wished that someone had inquired about his cane, because I was curious to know exactly the reasons he had for choosing that particular cane, or perhaps it's a cane that he himself designed. I don't know. But that was interesting to see. And of course, being getting on in years, I'm sure he has it for very practical reasons as well.
Okay, so this cane is a straight cane with a sort of an oval handle at the top, which is interesting. So that there are a couple of advantages to that. It does mean it's something that's easy to hook across a coat hook or something like that. You can probably stick your arm through that quite easily, so you don't have to hold on to the cane while you're fiddling with your billfold or whatever while you're paying for something. There's some advantages to having a circular handle like that on a cane. That's a great idea. Very practical.
Mm-hmm. And I imagine it's more comfortable too from a seated position, and then rising up from a seated to standing position, you then have two levels to grasp, so you can get a slightly better.
You can put both hands.
Both hands as well. Exactly. Yeah.
Well, that's a great idea. A great design.
And another interesting cane on Rao Antiques is one with a watch that's set into its handle, and it's to wind the watch, you actually spin the bezel on the top of the cane there. So it's somewhat reminiscent of what we talked about a few weeks back. The clocks that you're planning to engine turn, much like the clocks that Patek Philippe makes.
This is an interesting design, and it's I like that idea. It's sort of like an automatic, but instead of it relying on a weight to turn and wind, you're winding it manually. Now, I was thinking about the your clock comments later, and after I saw the clocks that you were talking about, they are a little bit different than the ones that I'm thinking about making. The ones I'm thinking about making are more like a picture frame, where it's a relatively flat piece. It doesn't. It's not a
cylinder with a dome on top. Okay.
Yeah, it's not a cylinder or a cube or something like that. It's nowhere near that thick. So it's a slightly different design, and it's so it doesn't lend itself to having a dome or something like that on the top of it. But I do like those ones that you posted. I do like the looks of them, and they certainly offer up some other design ideas that and design possibilities, because you do end up with a lot more surface area to experiment with. So there certainly are some interesting things you can do with that.
So fast forward 40 years, you need a cane. Would you engine turn yourself a nice handle?
I've thought about that. The problem is that 40 years from now, if I need a cane,
you can probably get hip and knee surgery and have the knees and hips of your youth back.
Well, I don't want the knees of my youth, to be honest. I did some horrible things to my knees when I was young, so I'm not sure that I necessarily want my knees from my youth. You're right; they're probably going to have better joint replacement when we're in our 80s than there is currently available. But I think if I needed a cane, the problem at that point is that it's something that needs to be practical, and a lot of the nice engine turning designs don't lead to being a practical cane. You do need a cane with a nice handle that's ergonomic, that's easy to use. So I certainly have thought about making a cane for myself in case I'm ever in need of one. I have occasionally needed one over the years, but I think that it would have to be something a little bit more practical than this. Something that's not quite as decorative. Although it might be interesting to do some ornamental turning down the length of the cane instead of some engine turning. So, maybe choose some nice African blackwood or some nice ebony or something like that. Some nice dense wood, or maybe some boxwood or something. Make a nice cane that's got some interesting ornamental turning down the length of it.
Yeah, some of the ornamental turning you've shown me from your books, just stunning. I had no idea that it was even possible to do that sort of thing in ivory and wood, and that was mechanized and as precisely done as it was, and so long ago too.
Going back to the comments earlier about the Medici, some of that work was being sponsored by them early on. So if you go through, I remember it's one of the Medici palaces that I was at in Florence. They have a number of the Coburg ivories, which were done early ornamental turning pieces. And it's funny because when when most people talk about any early form of an art, most people think of it's going to be quite crude. But these are absolutely fabulous. They're far more complex than stuff that people are doing today, and better executed than many of the pieces that came after them. And they're just absolutely fabulous. I would have a difficult time trying to recreate those today, even with the large arsenal of tools and modern machines and CNC equipment and things like that. It would be very, very difficult to reproduce those today. They were clearly being made by somebody who was doing that full time and was clearly a master of ornamental turning. And they were being made very early on in ornamental turning, so early 17th century, maybe into the 16th century. I don't remember the exact dates on them, but very, very early on in ornamental turning. And again, that was all stuff being funded by the Medici. So yeah, some absolutely fabulous work being done with that, and that's the kind of stuff that it's probably too ornate, that doesn't have any structural integrity. But some of the ornamental turning that's out there could look quite good if you did it properly on a cane.
I have a vague recollection of seeing those pieces now, but I really had no idea what I was looking at the time, so didn't appreciate them for what they were.
I didn't either. I have all these photos of it, and it was from before I was getting into ornamental turning at all. I knew about engine turning, and I didn't understand the relationship between engine turning and ornamental turning. And so I was walking through this palace, and I was seeing all these gorgeous pieces. So if I look through my camera roll at the time, I have dozens and dozens of photos of these spectacular pieces. I had no idea how they were made. I just knew that they were absolutely fabulous, and I had no idea how anybody had made them. And it's funny because even in the museum, they're really presented without any commentary, any description about what it is. They're basically shown as decorative items made out of ivory. There's really nothing more to them, more to the descriptions than that. There's nothing about how they were made or the engines that they were being made with or anything like that.
Thanks for listening to Off Hours. You can find detailed show notes at offhours.show. If you'd like to keep up to date with the show, follow us on Twitter @offhours. Jon can be found on Twitter @UnderTheLoop, and Chris can be found on Twitter and Instagram @silver_hand.